All right. Glad to see everyone. Thank you so much for being here, for joining us for this Switzer Network event, Climate Change's Equity Challenge, Creating a Movement for All of Us with Switzer Fellow Clara Fang. My name is Cora Preston. I'm the Network Manager for the Switzer Foundation, and I'm excited to welcome you all here today. Before we get started, I'd like to share about the Switzer Foundation's evolving land acknowledgement and reparations process. The foundation has begun making a financial contribution to an Indigenous-led organization connected to each event we hold, in addition to acknowledging the past and present injustices that allow us to occupy their lands. I'm going to share a link to our full land acknowledgement statement, recognizing that the Switzer Foundation office resides on occupied Penobscot territory. We invite anyone who would like to share their own land acknowledgement to do so when you introduce yourself in the chat. We welcome input and conversation about this, so please reach out to me if you have ideas, resources, or feedback on this topic. We are using a webinar format for today's event. You can use the chat to introduce yourself and share comments or resources. If you have questions for Clara, we will address those at the end of the presentation, and please enter those in the Q&A section rather than the chat so that we can easily find them at the end of the presentation. If you prefer, you can also email your questions to Clara to be answered later, and I'll put her email address in the chat. We are recording today's event, and a link to the recording will be posted on the Switzer Foundation's website and sent out to everyone who registered within a week or so. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Clara Fang. Clara Fang has been a climate advocate for 20 years and an equity consultant for the last 3. She's currently Senior Fellow at Citizens Climate International, an organization that builds political will for climate solutions around the world. Prior to CCI, she was a Student Engagement Director at Citizens Climate Lobby, where she oversaw programs that help thousands of young people learn advocacy skills, organize climate action in their communities, and lobby their elected officials for fair and effective climate practices. In addition to climate advocacy, she's working on a PhD in equity and inclusion in the climate movement at Antioch University and helps environmental organizations advance diversity, equity, and inclusion as an equity consultant. Clara serves on the board of directors of the Association of Environmental Studies and Sciences. She holds a BA in English from Smith College and a Master of Environmental Management from Yale University. Clara is also a 2021 Switzer Fellow. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Clara.
Thank you so much, Cora. I'm so honored that the Switzer Foundation has sponsored this talk, and grateful to everyone who has decided to join today. So in addition to what Cora said about me, I use she, her pronouns. I'm Chinese American. I consider myself a 1.5 generation immigrant, which is someone who immigrated between first and second generation. English is my third but primary language, and I identify as LGBTQ and ethically non-monogamous. I really like to thank the following people and organizations for helping me throughout my research: my advisors, research assistants, and these organizations who have helped me with funding, gathering research participants, and promoting this work. So I'd like to start with a brief explanation of some terms I'll be using. People of color is a term that we're using to refer to people who are not white in the United States, including Black, Indigenous, Latino, Asian, and mixed race. Some argue that this term is too broad and serves to erase specific identities of people who it refers to. So whenever possible, I'd like to use the specific terms such as Black or Indigenous if we are talking about those groups. I believe people of color is a useful term to talk about similarities of non-white people in the United States and around the world, but we should use specific terms whenever possible. BIPOC is another term that has been used to distinguish the experiences of Black and Indigenous people from the experiences of people of color, where they experience somewhat different oppressions. People of the global majority is used to refer to people of the global South and people of color to indicate that they are a majority in the global population as opposed to Europeans and white people. Also, Black versus lowercase and capital white versus lowercase. APA and the New York Times have standardized the use of capital B and W for those terms to indicate that race is a social construct and not as an adjective to describe the physical appearances of people. I also say real quick that I use the terms diversity, inclusion, and equity. Even though diversity has somewhat fallen out of favor, I do think that it is still important to indicate that the presence of differences is important for equity and inclusion as a state of being welcoming and belonging, but that we need both diversity and inclusion to really have equity. So a little about how I came to this work and where I came from. I grew up in Shanghai from 1983 to 1992 until I was 9 years old, a city with a current population of 28.5 million. To put that into context, this is 3.5 times the population of New York City. Back then, the city was extremely bad for air pollution. Most families, including mine, used coal-fired stoves to cook their food. Factories and industries were located within the city next to residential neighborhoods. So the sky was pretty much always gray, and everybody had respiratory problems, including myself as a child. And that was kind of considered pretty normal, and I didn't know anything else growing up. A research study found that about 49,000 people die a year due to air pollution in Shanghai. Shanghai is also rated #1 in the world for megacities most vulnerable to climate change. Shanghai sits at an average of 13 feet above the mean tide, making it particularly vulnerable to sea level rise. The city is also prone to heavy rains and intense summer heat with 100% humidity, and most households do not have air conditioning. In addition to 28.5 million people at risk, Shanghai is also an economic powerhouse and financial center for the world. So climate disruption there has major implications around the world. So I also moved to the US when I was 9 years old, and from there I was able to enjoy a natural environment, less smoke, and to participate in outdoor activities and political activities. So even though the residents of Shanghai are not really able to participate in their government, I am able to, and that's not something that I take for granted. So what does a climate leader look like? When we think about that, we probably think about Greta Thunberg or Al Gore, James Hansen, Jane Goodall, Bill McKibben. These are like the climate activists who have been in the media and which we see in TV a lot. And they are all white and also old, with the exception of Greta. And there's a lot of reasons that contribute to the reason that so many climate activists and environmental organizations tend to be made up of a lot of white people. In the early 19th century, when many of these mainstream environmental organizations were getting started in the US, they were founded by elite white men who were interested in keeping these environmental organizations as a group of the elite. They were beneficiaries of capitalism, institutional racism, and patriarchy. They intentionally excluded membership from women, people of color, and poor people. And they were uninterested in addressing the social inequalities of the time, like slavery, the oppression of women, and the abuse of labor. Their agenda were often harmful to BIPOC. They took land from Native American tribes to make room for new national parks and monuments. They criminalized people for subsistence activities, turning them into squatters and poachers. They willfully annexed land from Latinos and incited violence on those that resisted. And they dispossessed land promised to newly emancipated Black citizens after the Civil War. So you can imagine that after hundreds of years of colonialism, slavery, oppression, and literally kicking people out of nature and environmental organizations, people of color didn't feel that the environmental movement is a place they can call home and are reluctant to call themselves environmentalists. So from the literature review that I conducted, we can see that people of color are underrepresented in environmental organizations. So in this chart, like going back to 2008, we see that people of color were about 12% of the staff of environmental organizations in the US in 2008, and this increased to 16% in 2018. But compared to the population of people of color in the general population, we see that the gap hasn't closed much during that time. Since 2018, there has been a pretty significant change. So this data is from Green 2.0, which solicits the diversity data from the top 40 environmental NGOs. And they found that since 2018, the percentage of POC as part of the full-time staff of these organizations grew 10%, and same with senior staff. In the general population, this trend is growing pretty strong. Non-Hispanic whites will drop below 50% of the US population sometime around the year 2043. And people of color will become more than 50% of the population. So with this change in the population, we really need to hear more from people of color on decisions. They will be more important for elections. And also we see a lot of efforts at voter suppression that disproportionately affect people of color. So when I talk about equity, I am leading with race. And why does equity lead with race? Of course, there are many ways that people can be oppressed due to identity, from gender, race, age, physical ability, income, a whole host of factors. But in the United States, race continues to be the greatest predictor in all indicators of progress and well-being. The Pew Center reports that the median wealth of white households is 20 times that of African-American households and 18 times that of Hispanic households. This gap exists regardless of education level. When people are economically disadvantaged, they have less resources to cope with climate impacts. By prioritizing race in climate resilience, we can address the root causes of inequity while also addressing factors such as income, gender, and disability that worsen racial inequity. Leading with race does not mean only race, but it is a way of taking into account the profound impact that racism, including slavery, Native American genocide, and racial exclusion, has had on every aspect of US society. Climate change affects everyone, as we know, but the impacts are not experienced equally across populations. So a few facts regarding the disproportionate climate impacts on people of color. African Americans constitute 13% of the US population, contribute 23% less than white Americans to climate change, but bear 21% more of the harms when compared to other racial groups. Black Americans in urban areas are more likely to live in places with dangerously hot temperatures and are twice as likely to die from dangerous heat compared with other groups. Black households in the US experience the most economic damage from natural disasters, losing on average $50,000 per household in the aftermath of a natural disaster, while white households gain $75,000. So if we think about the disproportionate impacts from different climate disasters, in terms of flooding, vulnerable populations, they might live in aged and crumbling infrastructure, have a corruption and distrust in the government, which makes it harder for them to get help. Their homes may be beyond repairs. Homes may not have insurance. Existing financial and health problems may exacerbate the impacts of flooding. And they may have nowhere else to go when their house is flooded. So this actually happened to me last summer, where we had a huge flood in Detroit that was declared a national disaster. And my home was fairly old, and my basement flooded 8 inches. All of my appliances no longer functioned. And due to the problems in the city infrastructure, the pumps were not operating, the situation could not be remedied. My insurance did not cover flooding. So I ended up having to pay $10,000 in repairs, which did not include any of the losses of personal property. And I got incredibly sick. So in the week right after the flooding, I felt lightheaded and fatigued and couldn't really work, and there was nowhere else to go. So that really gave me an experience of the injustices that people in vulnerable communities experience when it comes to climate change. Also, low-income people tend to live in urban heat islands without tree cover. These places may lack green space. They may not have air conditioning in their home. If they do manual labor outdoors, then that makes them more vulnerable to high temperatures. The elderly, sick, and children are also more susceptible. You may live in a community that lack access to healthy food, and you may not have space to grow food, or you have poor insulation in your homes, which makes rising costs of utilities and extreme temperatures difficult to bear, or if there is not enough health insurance, that also makes impacts difficult. So another reason why we should be concerned about inequity in climate change is due to the drain pool politics. So racism doesn't just harm Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but everyone. Heather McGhee, in her new book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, calls this the drain pool politics. So she talked about how in the early 20th century, many American cities had these large public pools that were the pride of the community. These pools would have sand from a beach, a fancy diving board, and room for 10,000 swimmers, but they were white only. But when civil rights leaders successfully pushed for them to be integrated, many cities either sold the pools to private entities or eventually drained them and closed them down for good. McGhee employs the metaphor of a drained, cracked public pool to make the larger point that right refusal to share resources available to all US citizens doesn't just hurt people of color, it hurts the white families and their futures too. So this kind of politics are built on this lie that many white Americans have bought into for centuries, that when Black or brown people gain something, white people lose. Drain pool politics also explains why the US does not have a universal healthcare system, why public schools continue to fail students and teachers, why efficient public transit is non-existent in most American cities, why we cannot pass a livable minimum wage, why the COVID-19 pandemic in the US is the worst in the world. We can also see how it has impacted our ability to pass climate legislation. The climate is a commons, and the politics of the drain pool says that rather than giving those people access to the commons, we will all do without it. So my research explores diversity and inclusion and equity in the climate movement. So I'm looking at how diverse is the climate movement? What are the representation of people of color? How are BIPOC and white climate activists different? What are the barriers to engagement? And what can we do to improve engagement in the climate movement? My methods included literature review, survey, and interviews. The survey was returned by 1,003 participants, garnered from my outreach to climate organizations and self-identified climate activists in a snowball sampling method. I conducted 18 interviews with BIPOC climate activists and professionals who are working in the fields of sustainability, climate policy, and environmental management. The results I'm going to talk about today are mostly from the survey. Don't really have enough time to do all of the interviews, maybe a follow-up webinar. But there's a lot of both qualitative and quantitative data in the survey that I think you'll find very interesting. So some biases and limitations. The climate activists in the survey were self-identified. So, I didn't check to verify their affiliations or their past. If they said they were climate activists, then they took the survey. They were self-selected. So this tended to bias those who are already active and interested in this topic. There was not much participation from younger organizations, as much as I had hoped. And for those who did respond, I found that BIPOCs tended to have a lower response rate than the white survey respondents, and they contributed fewer comments. The survey was also administered from January to June during the pandemic in 2021. And there was some unevenness in the survey, meaning that a few organizations got different questions. So what organizations do these climate activists belong to? I had 949 responses. Most of them came from Citizens Climate Lobby, and then Climate Reality Project, then a whole bunch of smaller organizations, fewer people for these organizations, and a lot of other. So most of the respondents said they belong to more than one organization, some as many as 10. 78% of them identified as having white ethnic affiliation. The next largest category was Asian and Asian American, then Latino, African American, Native American, North African, Middle Eastern, and then Hawaiian Pacific Islander. When asked, do you consider yourself BIPOC or white? Some of the people who had indicated as having more than one racial affiliation consider themselves BIPOC. So it breaks down to 30-70 here. The climate activists were mostly women for both POC and white. In terms of age, there was a significant difference between the white activists and the people of color. White activists tended to be more old, above 64 was the largest category. For the people of color, they were more young, 18 to 24 or 25 to 34, and then less as the age ranges got older. In terms of political persuasion, they were pretty much identical, very progressive or moderately progressive, less than 20% identified as moderate or conservative. How would you describe your social economic status? So there was some significant difference here with the white group identifying more upper middle class. And then in the POC group, a bigger block of lower middle class, but also dominantly middle class and upper middle class. The POC tended to have joined the organizations more recently. So a lot of them said they've been in the organization less than a year, and then following that 2 years and so forth. With the white group also, a lot of them said fairly recently, and then more than 10 years was only 10%. These two are pretty much the same here. Most of the respondents said they were volunteers or staff donors. How many times have you contacted your elected officials about climate change in the past year? So here we see that the people of color group had the largest block in 1 to 3 times, and the whites 10 times or more was larger than POC. How often do you talk to your family or friends about climate change? So not too different here. How many times have you participated in a public march or demonstration on climate change in the last 2 years? Fairly similar here, none was the most popular response, but there were some people who said more than 5 times. A lot of people said that due to COVID, they did not participate as much as they normally would have. How many times have you met with elected officials or representatives on climate change in the last year? More than 50% for both groups said none. And here was also where they said because of COVID, they didn't meet in person as much as they would have. How many hours a week do you spend volunteering with a climate organization? With POC, there are more respondents who said 1 to 3 hours. So in summary, the dominant groups in this sample of climate activists were white, women, under 35, over 55, progressive, middle class, been involved less than 10 years, and volunteers or an active role. And in the minority were people of color, men, those who identified as non-binary, 35 to 54, moderate or conservative, lower class, and upper class. So the demographic and engagement questions were followed by a series of open-ended questions. They were able to type their response in a comment box, and then I coded them according to the themes that appeared in their comments. Many of their comments mentioned more than one worry or more than one challenge. So for the BIPOC group, the 2 most frequent worries were inaction on the part of government and people to do something about climate change and extreme weather. And then there were all kinds of other worries. I won't read them all to you here. For the white group, the most frequent responses were future generations and inaction. So a lot of people said, I'm worried about the future of my grandchildren, my children. I'm worried about the government not acting on climate change, and then a lot of other things. So here's one of the comments. I'm constantly anxious about extreme weather events impacting my family and loved ones, about the effect of climate change on wildlife, about effects of climate change on communities most vulnerable, about climate justice. It can be easy at times to feel overwhelmed by it all. So this was from a person of color. I asked them, how does climate change impact you? And for the BIPOC group, 63% mentioned direct impacts, including heat, flooding, fire, sea level rise, that somehow it directly impacted their lives. Then we had behavior change, meaning climate change has caused them to shift their behavior in some way, get involved with climate organizations or drive less or something like that. And then a bunch of other impacts. For the white group, the most frequent answer was mental health. So people mentioned feeling depressed and anxious and afraid. Direct impacts was less than the BIPOC group, but also quite a lot. People said they were impacted by smoke from wildfires or flooding and heat, and then a lot of other impacts. All right, so 2 comments from people of color. I grew up in Bangalore, India, a city with one of the most polluted water systems. We were supposed to run out of drinking water in 2018. I also come from a long lineage of farming families. I have seen most of my aunts and uncles suffer from crop failures. Climate change also affects me in so many different ways. It almost feels impossible to answer this. I can't think of a single aspect of my life that isn't affected by climate change. So they were asked, what challenges or barriers do you experience to participation in the climate movement? A lot of different answers were given by both groups. For the BIPOC group, time was the most frequently cited barrier, and then lack of representation. And then there were a lot of other ones kind of trailing that: burnout, indifference, money, problems with democracy, lack of opportunities, youth, lack of confidence or hope, and so forth. For the white group, time was also a pretty frequently cited barrier. And then indifference was the second largest category, and then a lot of these other ones. What I noticed was that for the white group, a lot of the challenges they cited were those outside themselves. So like the indifference of people, or resistance to change, or inaction from the government. They also cited challenges with physical and mental health, but a lot of it was just feeling frustrated with other people. For the BIPOC group, lack of representation came up pretty high, which really did not show up at all in the white group. And this is where they said they felt like there were not enough other people of color in the movement. They were often the only ones. This was exhausting due to being tokenized, having microaggressions, feeling a burnout, needing to take on diversity conversations. So some of the comments regarding challenges: being a BIPOC, I'm treated as more of a token. Abusive white men in power in the movement, being stripped of credit for my work. 21 years ago, no one gave me the time of day. Now everyone wants me. I also thought this was a really interesting response from a white person. I fail to see an intersectional political analysis of the climate crisis, especially coming from older white folks in the climate movement. This lack of intersectionality makes climate a barrier, making climate work seem elitist and not oriented in justice. This is especially the case when folks promote technology solutions, i.e. solar panels, electric vehicles, without addressing root causes of oppression that allow the climate crisis to come about, i.e. colonialism, racial capitalism, and patriarchy. What systemic or structural changes will make participation in the climate movement easier for you? So for the BIPOC, they said more training and education on like how to take climate action, on the science of climate, more government action, more diversity and inclusion, opportunities for action, elevate frontline communities, youth engagement, economic system change, intersectionality, climate jobs and funding, changing the narrative, structure, technology, etc. For the white people, they said government action would be the most helpful thing, the change that they would most like to see. And then following that, diversity and inclusion, training and education, more democracy, economic system change, intersectionality, climate jobs and funding, changing the narrative, structure, coordination between organizations, resilience and motivation, elevating frontline communities, and etc. I highlighted these two items that I did because for the white group, coordination between organizations was mentioned quite a few times, meaning they felt like there were so many organizations doing lots of different things and they felt overwhelmed, like they wish that organizations would communicate with each other and coordinate actions. Whereas this was not really mentioned at all with the BIPOC group, and they said more like we feel like there aren't enough actions and we would like to see more opportunities for action. So a couple comments. Having more full-time opportunities that pay enough to accomplish my financial goals, to break generational poverty with my family, and help support my grandmothers would allow me to more easily move into the climate justice space and act every day to change our trajectory. Another one, student debt cancellation, affordable free healthcare, affordable free rent, and guaranteed housing. So, a lot of the barriers regards to like time, burnout, money, kind of came back to these strategies of saying Like capitalism is really bad for the climate movement because it means we need to focus all our time on making money and taking care of families, and then we don't have enough time to do climate activism. Right, so moving into some conclusions, I wanted to share with you this graphic from Dr. Eric Harder, who studies belonging in communities of people with disabilities. So he looks at belonging along a spectrum. So you're starting with exclusion, where you have a bunch of white and gray balls representing the mainstream group, and the marginalized group is not even in the picture. And then with segregation, the marginalized group is off to the side, separated from the mainstream group. With integration, the marginalized group is integrated into the main group, but they're kind of like all together in their own corner. With inclusion, the marginalized people are scattered throughout the mainstream group, and they are more integrated, but there's still a sense that they're the ones who are different. And then with belonging, in this state, you have everybody celebrated for their differences, people bringing value through their individuality, and there isn't a distinction of an in and out group. So what does it take for people to feel a sense of belonging? They say that it feels like being present, invited, welcomed, known, accepted, supported, cared for, befriended, and needed. And when we are talking about something as large as the climate movement, we're really looking at several different levels at which belonging and inclusion can be manifested. So on the personal level, we can do this work by recognizing our privileges, learning the history and implications of racism, and listening to the experiences of others. At the interpersonal level, this would mean being aware of microaggressions and reducing them, providing microaffirmations. This is an area that a friend of mine is working in, where white people tend to get a lot of microaffirmations, saying good job and we're glad that you're here. That helps them feel a sense of belonging, in which people of color don't get as much. Being intentional about inclusivity. So not just saying, oh yeah, we welcome everyone here, but really doing things to invite people, to elevate their voice, to give them credit for their work, and listen to voices that haven't been heard. Focusing on relationships and well-being, instead of results and urgency. At the institutional level, we can provide more opportunities for action, ways to access organizations and resources, payment, so not always relying on volunteer labor, and also paying people equitably for their work. Improving representation, so just having more people of color makes them feel less isolated and less burned out. So that's where diversity is important for a conversation. And you can do that by joining your institution's DEI or social justice committee, or serving on boards and positions of influence, and working across sectors and organizations. Then we also need to pay attention to the systemic level by being aware of intersectionality and working towards systemic change in the economy, in politics, and all these other issues that are really related to climate. And then just making your voice heard. I mean, I feel like a lot of this advice is a little bit geared towards white people. So for people of color, I would say, you're becoming the majority in the country, especially for younger generations. They tend to be more people of color than white. So just voting and being active can help us get more of the representation that we so need on climate. So what does a climate leader look like? There are so many wonderful, amazing young leaders now who are people of color. We see a few of them here. We can elevate their voices, support their work, contribute to their organizations. And if you go to my website, climatediversity.org/resources, I have here a couple of the papers that I've written on this topic and resources from other organizations that are working to promote the participation of people of color in the climate movement. Okay, and with that, I'll finish. If you would like to support my work, you could donate to my project. I'm also available to give talks, do research and consulting. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Clara. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us and your experiences. It was a wonderful talk, and we're really glad that you were able to share that with us today. As I said at the beginning, we have recorded this session and we'll be posting it on the Switzer Foundation website and sending it out to everyone who registered so folks can watch it again and dig into the content again. We do have time left for questions, so if anyone has questions that they haven't asked yet, please go ahead and enter them into the Q&A section. And we'll get started, dive into the questions with a question by Kim Hunter, and he asked that his question reads, I understand the need for BIPOC in the big greens traditional organizations, but does this data include BIPOC beginning our own orgs? There are several here in Michigan, for instance. And I think he's referring to the data that you shared at the beginning of your presentation, Clara.
Okay, yeah. So in the literature review, the data from Dorceta Taylor included over 3,000 organizations. So it's more than the big greens. Like she tried to get at a really broad range of environmental organizations. And in my own data, a lot of them were self-identified. So yeah, they were not just in the organizations that I solicited, but wherever.
Great, thanks. Deb Freeman asks, and we had another person ask about this too, about could you speak a little more in depth about the statistic you mentioned that white households benefit after climate disasters?
Sure. I think I'll say this from like an anecdotally my own experience, where I was, the victim of this flood disaster last year, and because I was a student and everything, like I really didn't have the opportunity to choose good insurance. So I didn't end up getting any insurance for the damages to the flood. And I applied for FEMA assistance, which we ended up getting 3,000, but that was like, not even a fraction of the damages that we actually incurred. And then I have a white friend who also had flooding in her basement, and her insurance covered everything in her house. So she was able to itemize all of her appliance damages, all of her personal losses. So she had like antiques in the basement, which she was able to claim thousands of dollars to get reimbursed on. Like she itemized cotton balls and steel wool, and she got FEMA assistance. So that's what happens when you have privilege.
Yeah, that's a great example. We had someone ask, did you find any positive aspects of being a BIPOC leader in climate activist organizations?
Positive aspects, like are there people of color leaders, or what are the benefits?
Yeah, how I interpret that is, in your survey results, did people talk about the positive aspects of being a BIPOC leader?
Um, let's see. I think overall we see that the BIPOC climate activists are really involved. And as I showed in my data, there wasn't really like a difference in terms of how much they contacted their elected officials or volunteered their time. In smaller surveys, sometimes I saw a small difference or thought maybe they would be less engaged, but it looks like they are just as engaged as white people, but they feel like they have more barriers and don't have as many opportunities. Yeah, and and like some of them said, like 20 years ago, nobody gave me a time of day, but like now it's like people are being more intentional about diversity. So that's some progress that they are happy about, but still very slow, and it's like, oh, like it took this long. And then of course the changes don't happen overnight, so like I remember like everybody being all upset about George Floyd, and like, oh, we need a DEI strategy, like let's get this going. And then like 2 years later, then they're like, okay, we're finally hiring a DEI manager for our organization.
Yeah, thanks. Let's see, we've got a ton of great questions coming in. Thanks everyone who's asking. Let's see. Scott asks, many environmental organizations are focused on protecting and preserving wild and scenic places, and most of their budgets and capacity are allocated to this. Do you have thoughts on how orgs like these can better incorporate equity into their work?
Yeah, that's a really active area for a lot of organizations. The colonial white supremacist approach to this traditionally has been to drive Native people out of those places to preserve the wildlife, or kind of like helicoptering in and being like, use our methods. And now there's much more emphasis on collaborating with the local community, integrating them into the decision making, more stewardship by local communities. Like when we look at conservation worldwide, it's something like the places where indigenous people live have the greatest concentrations of biodiversity, and it's so important that we support those indigenous indigenous people to steward their own land, and where we don't see that happening, then things go really wrong. So I think that this is something that environmental organizations are learning a lot about, and then also so much recognition that climate impacts everything, and you can't do conservation without working on climate. So a lot of these organizations are shifting more resources to climate.
Thank you. Let's see. Henry asks, did your survey find any significant differences between the CCL members and the other group members?
Yeah. I mean, so I did do a separate thing with CCL. I don't think they want me to single them out for anything, but I've been in CCL a long time, and they struggle with some things.
Fair enough. Let's see. Ron asked, your data appears to show welcome upward trends in participation by BIPOC individuals. Are you encouraged by that? And do you believe that inclusion and representation will continue to grow?
Yes, I really do think that they will. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of initiatives coming out of environmental organizations to help change this. And the fact that so many of you came today shows that there's a lot of interest across all levels of these organizations. And so much of that, is in the grassroots. Like if I go to a meeting of my local CCL chapter, how I am received by these local grassroots advocates will determine more than anything else whether I stay with that organization and how likely I am to participate. So it's really heartening to see more awareness around that. Even in the time that I've been doing this research, like 3 years ago, I think I felt like I saw more responses that were like, I don't feel like diversity is relevant to our climate work, and it's a distraction, and it's like a liberal agenda. And now, like I really don't see any responses like that. And people are like, more intersectionality, more environmental justice.
Yeah. Let's see. Brandon says, you have been doing really great environmental work. Through this study and your journey, what qualities do you think have helped you the most with getting to where you are today?
In terms of doing this work, oh, that's such a good question. I think not doing it alone is so important. Just being part of an organization and getting to know people has been so motivating. Sometimes when I tell people what I do, they're just like, oh, it must be so depressing, and the climate is doing so badly, and it's true, like it's really bad, and we don't see a lot of legislative action. But like, it doesn't feel depressing at all. I feel motivated all the time to do this, and this is what I most want to do. And I love the people that I do it with. And if you can, like, come to the CCL conference in DC in June. Like the first time I went in 2016, like being surrounded by 800 climate activists, all being like, yes, we can do this, we're here for it. It was so inspiring and motivating.
That's great. Let's see. Just looking through this long list of questions. I don't think we're going to have time to get to everything, but let's see. We had someone ask about if you could, that it didn't seem like there was a lot about specifically Asian leadership in climate activist organizations in your study. And, do you want to comment any more on Asian leadership in the US regarding climate?
Let's see. Well, I didn't think anyone went out, but as you can see, Asians were the largest non-white group of the climate activist respondents. So I think Asians are very active and care about this issue. I remember the Yale program on climate change communication, like their study on race and climate change in American Mind. Like they showed that the Asian population in the US were like least likely to be deniers, very supportive of government action. Really, like all the people of color groups were more supportive and less skepticism than the white group. There's also the Asian Environmental Network. So that's a great place to find people. So there are tons.
Definitely. Thanks. Let's see. Mindy asked about if there are any organizations with leadership that include BIPOC leadership that you would want to lift up. They were asking that because they're seeing a way to create a more inclusive movement as seeking collaboration with those organizations and highlighting their work that do have BIPOC leadership. So is there any, not to single anyone out, but are there any organizations that you would want to lift up in that way?
Yeah, I think the NAACP does great work, and they like started a whole climate section like 10 years ago, and they've put out studies that I found really helpful, and they're like trying to engage all of their members in climate action. So I think they're doing great work. And then there's this other organization called the Hip Hop Caucus, a national organization that has made climate one of its priorities. And then so many local organizations. So wherever you are, it'd be really good to find out who in your community is doing this work.
Definitely. Let's see. Stephanie asked about, they say that you mentioned that you didn't get much of a response from folks involved in younger organizations. Could you describe what, again, maybe what you classified as younger, and if there was anything telling about the experience of BIPOC advocates in younger versus older organizations?
Yeah, I was hoping to get more participation, like from Sunrise Movement and Zero Hour, which were both started by young people. They didn't really give much response to me. I think maybe because they felt like this was not an issue that they needed to address as much. Like they already had enough diversity, or you know, they needed their resources for other things. I did have one organization, the Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, who were really interested, you know, and so that was something that maybe they hadn't focused on as much. Yeah, I mean, it would be really great to have more of the young people in here.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on the end of the hour here, so I just want to thank you again, Clara, for that wonderful presentation and for sharing your wisdom and your experience with us. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's great seeing you all.
Yeah. And thank you to everyone who joined us. We're so glad you're all here.